your thoughts on what is being exposed now in terms of the enormous wealth, also the enormous theft, and this growing global movement, Dr. Horne?
Well, you probably should have a parasitologist on this panel, someone who studies parasites, because there's no worse example of parasites than the so-called royal family who've looted and plundered the world. And we should not overstate this idea of the royals being figureheads. I think that it's better to look at them as devious operators. I mean, for example, in countries like Canada and Australia, where the royals still serve as the head of state, you have a representative called the Governor General, whose role is supposedly ceremonial. But recall that in 1975 in Australia, when the Labour Party was moving to the left, the Governor General, the Queen's representative, helped to engineer a coup. Recall that in 1983, when the United States invaded Grenada, a tiny island in the Caribbean, once again, the Governor General collaborated with Washington in this escapade, and reportedly that infuriated the then British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. We should also remember that these parasites have not only looted Africa, there is an ongoing controversy with regard to the Greek government trying to recover the so-called Elgin marbles, which London refuses to return. And then there are all of the massacres and depredations. I'm thinking of what happened in what was called British India in Amritsar approximately a century ago. Recall what happened in Kenya, East Africa, during Queen Elizabeth's tawdry reign, when you had mass detentions, castrations, murders, all in the name of Her Majesty's government. Recall what happened also during Her Majesty's reign in 1953 in Guyana on the northern coast of South America, where the left-wing leader, Cheddi Jagan, was dislodged by the British military. And then London proceeded to stir up antagonisms between the population of South Asian descent and the population of African descent, which has been roiling the waters ever since. And I think we also should not forget how this minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe, speaking of England in the 1500s, was able to, in the next century, challenge for world supremacy. According to Andrew Young, the former mayor of Atlanta, former chief aide to Martin Luther King, he charged during his career there was actually racism, that Britain was able to escape the religious conflicts then roiling the world. That is to say, the Ottoman Muslims versus the Iberian, Spanish, Portuguese Catholics. Britain opted for Protestantism. There weren't that many Protestants around. And so they virtually invented the question of race, and then were able to co-opt Irish and Scots, and then ultimately Europeans from across the continent into this new identity politics of whiteness. And you turn that coin over, and those of us not inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness were then subject to exploitation and, in fact, enslavement. So we should be shedding no tears for the passing of the Queen. Instead, we should be redoubling our efforts to reclaim the wealth that they stole.
Horne, a lot of eyes now on what's going on between China and Russia. And you have made the case before that all of this is about not only weakening Russia, but with eyes to weakening China. And one has to wonder if that the US-led effort, Western effort to weaken China as well as Russia, if it's working. I mean, the impact that is having. And Dr. Horne, just your thoughts on where things are now in this whole geopolitical dance that's happening, Dr. Horne.
Well, a moment or two ago, we talked about the transition 500 years ago with the rise of London. I think we're living through another transition, which is the rise of China. And it appears to me, at least, that this war in Central Europe and Ukraine is meant to not only weaken Russia, but perhaps to bring back a Yeltsin-type regime, which will then allow the North Atlantic countries to plunder the vast resources of Russia and then stand up to China more effectively. This article in the New York Times this morning, which tries to fabricate some sort of rift between Beijing and Moscow, I think, is fanciful. They must assume that China cannot see what I'm seeing here in Texas, which is that Russia is a kind of firewall. And to the extent that Russia is destabilized, then next on the menu will be China. You see evidence of this transition through an article in the Financial Times of London just a few days ago, which suggested that Beijing is supplying more capital to various nations than the International Monetary Fund, and also more capital for building projects than the World Bank, the two institutions are located in Washington, D.C. There is a possibility that with the devising of this digital Chinese currency, that China will be able to circumvent this dollar-based economy, which has ruled the world since World War II. And already, whatever the New York Times says, you see that what's keeping the Russian economy afloat is not only sale of energy to China and thereby garnering of revenue, but also the supply of Chinese products, such as the Xiaomi mobile phone. I think also with regard to this recent counteroffensive that was successful by the Ukrainians, we have to look at that more carefully, particularly the visit to Kiev of Secretary of State Blinken, where he announced another huge package. And by the way, these huge packages are being announced as homelessness continues to escalate in cities like Los Angeles. But part of that package was not only going to Ukraine, it was going to the Baltics, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, going to Moldova, going to Bulgaria. There is an inference being drawn that there might be some sort of multi-pronged offensive from those nations. A Georgian parliamentarian, which of course fought a conflict with Russia a few years ago, suggested that Georgia declare war on Russia. And in any case, this escapade in Ukraine is backfiring. You would think that the sanctions imposed were against Germany and its European Union allies with regard to their energy bills skyrocketing, factories closing, growing anger at Norway, which is an energy producer and apparently is profiting handsomely from the dilemma and the problems of its European allies. And then by pulling away from Russia, all that means is that the Europeans are going to have to become more heavily dependent on Africa, nations like Algeria and natural gas, nations like Nigeria and Angola in terms of petroleum. And in those countries, those African countries, you still have a sour view of colonialism and the history, the inglorious history that was foisted upon them by these European colonizers. So in some senses, the Europeans, the North Atlantic countries might be headed from the frying pan to the fire. And also another point with regard to this transition, you see that BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, you have other countries battering down their doors, seeking admission, including the key NATO member, that is Turkey, which is now facing the prospect of being sanctioned by Washington because they're not gung-ho about this escapade against Russia. So I think that it leaves two lingering questions that we all need to contemplate. One, after the fall of the Soviet Union, why wasn't Moscow invited to the top table of imperialism? Instead, you had an expansion of NATO to its borders, which was bound to generate a negative reaction. And two, why isn't there more discussion in the United States as to how this 1972 anti-Soviet pact by Henry Kissinger and Richard M. Nixon led to the rise of China and the dilemma faced by U.S. imperialism?